Well, I'm glad to be here with you again today in this series of studies from the Acts of the Apostles. And in the last message, I finished in the middle of chapter 22 of the Acts of the Apostles, because what happened was that in Jerusalem, when Paul is challenged, first of all, by the commander of the forces, of the soldiers, first of all, the question was to the commander, he said, "Do you speak Greek?" And then the commander is questioning what nationality that Paul is questioning, whether he's an Egyptian. And this is still in chapter 21. Paul answered in verse 20, "I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city." So he was then allowed to speak to the people. And in the beginning of chapter 2, as you remember, he was speaking in Aramaic. It's quite interesting, because when the people heard him speaking in Aramaic, they listened. And then he gives his testimony. So at the end of his testimony, and he's explaining about his conversion and what happened, then immediately the Lord actually said to him, "Leave Jerusalem." This is in verse 18 of 22. When he returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I felt that I saw the Lord speaking, and the Lord said to me, "Leave Jerusalem immediately, because they will not accept your testimony." And in verse 19, he replied to the Lord, "These men know I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believed in you, Lord. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there giving my approval." And in verse 21, then the Lord spoke clearly to Paul and said, "Go." That means leave Jerusalem. I will send you far away to the Gentiles. Now, by the time we come to verse 22, the crowd listened to Paul until he said this last statement. Then they raised their voices and shouted, "Rid the earth of him, he's not fit to live." And as they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the commander ordered Paul to be taken into the military barracks. Then he directed that he be flogged and questioned in order to find out why the people were shouting at him. Now, this is where it gets very interesting, because in verse 25, as they literally stretched him out and bound him to flog him, Paul said to the centurion, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" So his first defense is that he is a Jew of the highest order. Now he's claiming he is a Roman citizen. So in verse 26, when the centurion heard this, he went to the commander, reported, and said, "What are you going to do? This man's a Roman citizen." So in verse 27, the commander went to Paul himself and asked, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" And he answered, "Yes." The commander said, "I had to pay a big price for my citizenship." Paul says, "I was born a citizen." Now, this is very interesting, because Paul he's already confessed in his testimony he was born in Tarsus. He was very much the son of a Jewish, very Orthodox Jewish family. He was a Pharisee, as it shows in his testimony. But the commander is questioning how Paul, from Tarsus, Cilicia, Turkey in modern terms, could be a Roman citizen. And we discover that what happened was that Tarsus had become taken over as a fully Roman city and given all the rights and privileges. And therefore, because Paul was born around at the same time that Jesus was born, he was born in Tarsus, a Roman citizen. Therefore, he was born a Roman citizen. So this does present quite a different situation. So by the time Paul says in verse 28 of chapter 22, I was born as a citizen, in verse 29, those who were about to question him withdrew, and the commander was alarmed when he realized that he'd put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains, because Roman citizens had the right to sue and be sued in the courts, and the right to have a legal trial when they could appear before a proper court. They even had the ability, which Paul eventually uses, to appeal to Caesar himself. Now, I've discovered, and it's very clear, that the law said that a Roman citizen could not be tortured or whipped or scourged, nor could they receive the death penalty unless they were guilty of treason. So you understand that actually Paul is now trying to save his life. So his appeal as a Roman citizen meant they couldn't flog him. Right. Verse 30. The next day, since the commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. Chapter 23 comes a little bit further because Paul looked at the Sanhedrin and said, brothers, my brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all conscience to this day. When he said it, the high priest, Ananias, ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. What an accusation against the high priest. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourselves violate the law by commanding that I should be struck. But it then infuriates the others who were standing near Paul and said, how do you dare insult God's high priest? Paul's reply was, brothers, I didn't realize he was the high priest, for it's written, do not speak evil about the ruler of your people. Then Paul, knowing that some of the Sanhedrin were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, then called out, brothers, I am a Pharisee. So look at his defense. To the Jew, he's a Jew. To the Romans, he's a Roman citizen. To the Sanhedrin, he's a Pharisee. Why? Because the Orthodox Jews were divided between Sadducees and Pharisees. One of the major differences being that Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. Pharisees did. So, in verse 6, chapter 23, verse 6, Paul knowing this, that some were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, called out, "Brothers, I'm a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee." It's quite interesting because he's a Roman citizen, born because he's the son of a Roman citizen. He's a Pharisee because he's the son of a Pharisee. "I stand on trial because of my hope in the resurrection of the dead." Wow! This is the very issue. You see, believers in Jesus Christ know absolutely certainly that Christ rose from the dead and that we will rise with him. But it says here so absolutely, he says, "I stand on trial because of my hope in the resurrection of the dead," which was not only because of his Christian faith, his belief in Jesus as the Messiah, but also because he was a Pharisee. And he immediately, a dispute broke out in the Sanhedrin between the two sides, and the assembly was divided because the Sadducees say there is no resurrection. They also say there are no angels or spirits, but the Pharisees acknowledged resurrection, angels, and so on. So by the time you come to verse 9, there's a tremendous uproar. And now you had a situation where it says that some of the Pharisees were teachers of the law, and they now entered into the argument, and the whole argument now is over resurrection. And because Paul had declared that he was a Pharisee and believed in the resurrection, they said, "We find nothing wrong with him." And they even said, "What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" Not recognizing Jesus. And in verse 10, the dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid that Paul, in the middle, would be torn in pieces in the dispute, simply not over him, but in the dispute between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. So the commander, not the high priest, the commander of the soldiers, then ordered the soldiers to go down, take him away by force, and bring him into the barracks. Now we come to verse 11, and it says, "Clearly the following night the Lord stood near Paul and said, 'Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome.'" So when we come to verse 12, now the whole situation gets really serious now. You have to look at this. Because the next morning, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves, this is a group of the Jews, and they bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they'd killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. So in verse 14, they went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We've taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we've killed Paul. Now then, we're asking you and the Sanhedrin to petition the military commander, the Roman commander, to bring Paul before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information. But we're ready to kill him before he gets here." So what actually is happening is, this is a horrendous situation, because what's happening is this group of the 40 Jews with the conspiracy to kill Paul are actually trying to influence the Jews, the chief priests and the elders, to get Paul brought before the Sanhedrin again. But it was a trap, that if that happened, these 40 men would overcome whatever guards there were with Paul and kill him. It's very interesting because one assassination attempt on me was in a similar line when I was held in that communist prison all those years ago, 50-odd years ago. And when I was put in a car and taken to where the trial was to be held near the border, one of the men, the lawyer, who to me said, "Why, we're close to the border." He said, "You're only a few hundred meters from the border. Why don't you make a run for it?" And I was tempted. I mean, you are tempted to escape. Well, men are tempted to escape. And only the Holy Spirit stopped me because I found out that they had a sniper rifle, which they pulled out of the back of the car intending to shoot me in the back. And it would have solved the problem because the court the following day would have been told I was shot while trying to escape. So what's happening to Paul is nothing unusual. They'd made a plot. They were going to kill him. But in verse 16, God does intervene. There's no question. Because when Paul's sister's son, his nephew, heard of the plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Now, it's amazing that Paul's sister's son was actually able to find out and hear about this plot. And so he goes in, tells Paul, and in verse 17, Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the garrison commander. He's something to tell him." So he took him to the commander, and the centurion said, "Paul, this prisoner that we're holding, sent for me, asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you." And in verse 19, the commander took the young man, drew him aside, and said, "What is it you have to tell me?" And in verse 20, this wonderful son of Paul's sister says, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul back before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush. They've taken an oath not to eat or drink until they've killed him. And they are ready, waiting for you to agree to send Paul to the Sanhedrin." So this is Paul's sister's son is explaining this to the Roman commander. He's not a Jew, he's the Roman commander. Verse 22, the commander dismissed the man and cautioned him, "Don't tell anybody that you've reported this to me." So in verse 23, the commander then calls two of his centurions and orders them, "Get ready, a detachment of 2. I mean, just look what they're doing. I'm finding this is so interesting because he was commanded to get 200 Roman soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. Goodness me, that's a small army. That's nearly 500. To go to Caesarea at 9 o'clock tonight. Provide a horse for Paul, that he may be taken safely to the Roman governor, Felix, at Caesarea." And he actually wrote a letter of explanation, explaining what's happened, saying that he was taken by the Jews. He's a Roman citizen. Paul's a Roman citizen, and he's been taken by the Jews, and they're about to kill him. But the commander says, "I came with my troops, I rescued him, because he's a Roman citizen. We're Romans, we rescued him. And I wanted to know what the accusation was. I brought him to the Sanhedrin and found out the only accusations against Paul were to do with Jewish religion. And so when I found out that the Jews had got a plot to kill him, I sent him to you and ordered the accusers to come to you to present the case. So it's very clear that by verse 31, the soldiers carrying out their orders took Paul with them during the night, brought him as far as Antipatris, and the next day they let the cavalry go on with him while they returned to the barracks. When the cavalry arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will hear your case when your accusers get here." Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. You know, this is a phenomenal story. It's absolutely phenomenal. So it says in chapter 24 that 5 days later, Ananias went down to the high priest, went down to Caesarea with some of the elders, and they brought accusations against Paul. When Paul was called in, the lawyer Tertullus presented his case before Felix, and saying, "We've enjoyed long peace unto you, and your foresight has brought reforms in this nation everywhere. Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude, but in order not to weary you, we ask you to hear this. We found this man a troublemaker, stirring up riots amongst the Jews all over the world. He's a ringleader of the Nazarene sect." Now, this is a new description. It's the first time this comes up. The Nazarene sect. And even tried to desecrate the temples. We seized him. By examining him yourself, you'll learn all the truth. And the Jews joined in the accusation, stating these things were true. But when the governor motioned for him to speak, Paul replied, "Felix, I know that for a number of years you've been a judge over this nation, so I gladly make my defense." And he makes the full defense here, giving the whole story. And so after it all, after several days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla. It's very interesting, who was a Jewess. And Felix then listened to him as he spoke about his faith in Jesus Christ. And when Paul spoke on righteousness, this is verse 24, chapter 24, as Paul discussed righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, "That's enough for now, you can leave. When it's convenient, I'll send for you." At the same time, he was hoping that Saul would offer him a bribe. So he sent for him frequently and talked with him, and he was there for 2 years. I want you to understand, he was there for 2 years. Felix died and was succeeded by Porcius Festus, but because Felix wanted to grant a favor, he left Paul in the prison. So actually, Paul is in prison here in Caesarea for 2 years. And then in chapter 25, 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. And this really is developing into such a powerful story. I'm going to make a break here because the result is, from all of this, that even finally King Agrippa arrived in Caesarea to meet with Festus. And Festus discovered Paul's case with the king. And he said, "There's a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner when I went to Jerusalem. The chief priests and elders of the tribe brought charges against him and wanted him condemned. I told it, it's not the Roman custom to hand him over to any man, before he's faced his accusers. When they came here, I did not delay the case, but convened the court and brought the man in. When his accusers made the accusation, they didn't charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. Instead, they had some points of dispute about their own religion and what he calls a dead man named Jesus, whom Paul claimed was alive. What a statement. I was at a loss how to investigate this. And so Agrippa says to Festus, I want to hear this man himself. Tomorrow I will hear him.
My God will supply all your needs according to his glorious riches in Christ Jesus. What a wonderful promise! When you are committed to and support the gospel, then stand on this promise that when you give to the extension of the kingdom, God will supply all your need. Jesus called it giving and receiving. This year God has given us wonderful opportunities to preach the gospel in Armenia, Georgia, and Poland. And we continue to support Ukraine by distributing humanitarian and spiritual aid. For 12 months, our staff have helped the displaced, vulnerable, and injured, supplying food and medicines. To make a donation, visit eurovision.org.uk/donation. Strength for now and for eternity. David will guide you through the Apostle Paul's letters to the Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. David has written this book to strengthen your faith at a time when everything around us is being shaken. Join David as he delves deep into the truths of the Bible. Order David's book, A Firm Foundation, by visiting our website, eurovision.org.uk/shop. We would like to give you a free gift. David Hathaway's Prophetic Vision magazine is available free of charge. All you need to do is ask for it. This faith-building resource will show you the path to revival in your life and ministry. To receive this free magazine, visit eurovision.org.uk/magazine.